radical act to preserve our own history, because we've never really been able to do that in this country. And so, hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today on this really beautiful evening. I don't know where you're at, but it's about 75 degrees here and the sun is shining. My name is Lisa Kelly. I am the founder and executive director of Memorialize the Movement. These are my teammates, Adem and Frederica. And Memorialize the Movement is a grassroots initiative to protect and preserve the plywood protest murals that were created in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the riots and protests that followed in the uprisings of 2020 last year. And our mission is to continue to activate these boards and murals in our community as an act of protest to kind of respect the lifespan and their original purpose when they were up on the boards. So we decided that we would start, like everyone else, with the lighting of a candle for those that we've lost. Yeah, actually do them. And then, no, I shouldn't sit that there. And we wanted to read off some of the names of Black and Brown people who were victims of police brutality. That's a very long list. And we were trying to decide, where to start in that list. And I thought that in acknowledgement of the limited time that we have and to not overwhelm ourselves, that we would just start from January of 2020 till today. So if you guys want to pull up those slides, we will each read a name. And we know that this isn't everyone. Like I said, the list goes on way before January of 2020, but we've done our best to identify and name as many souls as we could find. So if you know of a name of a Black person who was murdered by police or who was a victim of police brutality in the last year, please put their name in the chat so that they can be seen. Okay. Andre Hill.
Miles Jackson.
Makia Bryant.
Daunte Demetrius Wright.
Marvin David Scott.
Patrick Lynn Warren Sr.
Vincent Vinny Belmonte.
Dolal Idd.
Angelo Quinto.
Andre Maurice Hill.
Casey Christopher Goodson Jr.
Angelo AJ Crooms.
Sincere Pierce.
Marcellus Dinette.
Jonathan Dwayne Price.
Dejan Duran Kizzy.
Rayshard Brooks.
Carlos Carson.
David McAddy.
Tony the Tiger McDade.
George Perry Floyd.
Dries John Sean Reed.
Michael Ramos.
Daniel T. Prude.
Breonna Taylor.
Manuel Manny Elijah Ellis.
William Howard Green.
Okay, I just want to take a moment, just a moment of silence to remember those that we've lost over the last year and a half. And we can do that now. Thank you. Let's start with a deep breath. All right, Frederica, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa. The Twin Cities has stood witness to a year of violence against Black bodies like no other. In the wake of not only George Floyd's murder on May 25th, 2020, but Dolal Idd on September 30th, 2020, and now Daunte Wright on April 11th, 2021. In response, people took to the streets to create, in words and images, a visual record of the movement through protest art. Things that the city would much rather keep hidden, we bring to light. For Memorialize the Movement, archival work is not simply an academic exercise, it serves as a form of protest. Through this process, racialized bodies salvage, preserve, and record ephemeral objects that are artifacts of movements that their oppressors seek to destroy. Our team, led by Black women confronting the tyranny of institutionalized brutality in the Twin Cities, contends that it is imperative that Black people be the sole keepers of the boards that have been created to depict our processing of communal trauma. By taking the ephemeral and making it permanent, defending the boards and their physicality while simultaneously working towards placing this protest within the digital realm, our Black women-led team records the legacy of the movement in a manner which no other in the nation would be able to replicate through the amplification, preservation, and maintenance of the communal Black memory of the violence experienced at the hands of white police officers in the Twin Cities against unarmed members of the public. This project is a testament to the resilience of the Black community and serves as a reminder that the opposing force to war is not peace, but creation, particularly as it exists at the intersections of community praxis and artistic expression. These writings on the walls, as they manifest on plywood boards, exemplify the importance of street art and graffiti. Street art is the single most widely available and accessible field of art that exists for both artists and fans alike. Street art is often providing an introduction to the arts within the public realm earlier than it is encountered within institutional spaces. Our stories may be deemed too contentious for the palettes of major art institutions that occupy our cities, for these buildings are ones that were constructed with an inherent interest in upholding the characteristics of white supremacy for centuries to come. Even if our stories are embraced, they're often misrepresented or deliberately diluted. We seek to keep the art produced by and for the community accessible within the community. From a theoretical perspective, our work is inherently shaped by critical race theory, also known as CRT, which is how I will refer to it going forward. CRT serves to foster the critical examination of the construction of race with the ultimate intent of eradicating racism alongside the restoration of justice. The inquiry-based principles that compose CRT have been developed with the intention of revealing inequality, naming said inequality, establishing procedures to create or restore justice, and eliminating the social construction of privilege as it exists through racism. The central credo of CRT is that racism is pervasive and will never, I repeat, never be fully eradicated as a consequence of the ubiquity of whiteness, but the work prevails nonetheless through three core tenets: counter-narrative, interest convergence, and critiques of liberalism. In the process of preserving these ephemeral works of art, our team embodies the core tenets of this theory as we, one, collect and make available the narratives of Black people in order to illuminate their racialized experiences and to thereby reclaim and counter a dominant narrative of white norms. Two, recall and reveal that interest convergence dominates the white inclination to eschew racism, stipulating that Black people achieve civil rights victories only when white and Black interests converge, and therefore it is necessary that the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul recognize that there are tangible consequences for white failings to respect Black bodies, such as we've seen with the Minneapolis uprisings of 2020. And three, reject liberalism as an ideology and reveal its endeavors to destabilize conscious effort and language centered on race. Recentering BIPOC voices in anti-racist work, particularly in white-dominated fields such as object conservation, curation, and archiving, requires a committed focus and approach. In social justice circles, we often do something that is called calling out, which normally includes someone publicly pointing out that another person is being oppressive. Calling someone out serves two primary purposes. It lets that person know that they're being oppressive, and it lets the people around them know that that person was being oppressive. By letting others know about this person's oppressive behavior, more people can hold them accountable for their actions. While staying silent about injustice means being complicit in oppression, calling out lets someone know that what they're doing won't be condoned. Calling out essentially aims to get the oppressive person to stop their behavior. However, calling in seeks to do this with compassion, which defines our focus when working with other white people. Even those with the best intentions and the fiercest loyalties to this work can fall short in their actions towards BIPOC people. And to further illuminate what this means, I would like to include in our discussion an invaluable quotation from Naklak Shan, a Viet mixed race immigrant, queer, and gender weird disabled writer, from their article, Calling In, a Less Disposable Way of Holding Each Other Accountable. They say, I picture calling in as a practice of pulling folks back in who have strayed from us. It means extending to ourselves the reality that we will and do make mistakes, which I'm paraphrasing to be more appropriate for this stream. We stray, and there will always be a chance for us to return. Calling in as a practice of loving each other enough to allow each other to make mistakes, a practice of loving ourselves enough to know that what we're trying to do here is a radical unlearning of everything that we have been configured to believe is normal.
Thank you, Frederica. So I guess right now I'd like to take a step back. In my introduction, I usually give a little bit of backstory about how Memorialize the Movement was born following George Floyd's murder and the uprisings. And I didn't do that this time, but I definitely think that it's important for this audience because you may not have heard the story. And so if you want to, Logan, if you want to recenter or re-spotlight us. I don't know if it is. Yeah, or I guess Frederica too, though.
All right.
Well, I always start with my reaction to the murder of George Floyd. And I start there because everything before that is non-existent to me now. Everything before then is pointless for the most part, because the way that I have changed as a person and the way that my purpose has changed since that day has shifted so drastically from who I was and what I was doing before that day that it's almost not worth mentioning. So I always start there. It was heartbreaking, and I think Adem and Frederica can speak to that as well, that, you know, it was devastating. We were frozen, we were numb, we could not move, we could not get out of bed. But yet we felt this really strong urge to act, to do something, to contribute and be a body in the street or a voice in the protests, to contribute to the food drives or the cleanups or the supply drives or raise money for the family or this or that organization. And yet none of it really felt like enough. You know, you're going and going for 12 plus hours a day in the midst of this global pandemic, and yet nothing feels like it's enough because George Floyd is still dead. So many others before him still murdered. I'm still grieving. We were all still grieving. And that's kind of where I started to think about ways in which I can affect some sort of change in our community that would have a lasting effect, something that would outlive the protests and the riots and the food drives. And that's really when the boards started to speak to me. You know, we have so many murals here in Minneapolis. We ourselves have collected over 750, almost 800 at this point. And there's so many more out there. And each one was done by a single entity or a community of people. And each one spoke to the grief and the trauma and the pain that we were feeling collectively. And I couldn't put words to my grief at that time. I couldn't put words to my trauma. And so seeing my feelings and my thoughts and my need for change reflected on these murals really created this connection, this emotional connection. You know, I like to say that the people who wrote on the murals or created an image or a visual or a quote or a poem, they left a bit of themselves there. You know, the boards were therapeutic for a lot of people because we didn't know how to process at the time when we were moving and going and going. And so being able to just kind of stop everything for a moment and lay it all out there on the boards so that you can get back to your life, so that you can get back to your friends and your family and your day job. A lot of people did that. And so I feel that, you know, the boards in themselves are almost alive now with the souls and the spirits of those who poured their hearts out on those murals and on those boards. And that's kind of where I landed. One day it just kind of occurred to me, like, what's going to happen when they're taken down? What's going to become of them? Are they going to be destroyed? And then the bigger fear, are they going to end up in a white-owned museum or institution? Are they going to tell our story in a watered down way that appeals to other white people who didn't experience this on the same level that we did? And that's when the drive to preserve them, but not just preserve them for myself or for my community, but preserve them so that Black people can be the ones to share that story and to control that narrative. And Frederica put it so eloquently, it's a radical act to preserve our own history because we've never really been able to do that in this country. And so for us to make that decision, whether or not it was conscious at the time, to take control of our own narrative, be the ones to care for and preserve our history and our own historic artifacts was a really powerful first step. And I don't think at the time when I hopped in my boyfriend's Jeep and started handing out flyers and picking up boards as they came down, that I even grasped the full complexity of what I was doing. It wasn't until later that I realized, once I had a chance to process, it's when I realized, you know, the scope of what I had done and how it affected people, how positively people received that, and how powerful and emboldened Black and Brown people felt once we realized that we could tell this story, once they realized that there was a Black woman at the forefront of the preservation of these murals. So that's kind of where it started. It's me and my partner in a Jeep handing out flyers, collecting boards. And that was back in June of 2020. And since then, over the last 10 or 11 months, the project has grown exponentially and is kind of forming itself, evolving on its own naturally into a nonprofit organization that will sustain itself and continue to tell the stories of Black people who have been brutalized by police officers and strive for police accountability. But more importantly, as Frederica pointed out, we're doing something that is never really being done, which is we're deciding what art is, we're deciding what our history and our artifacts look like, and then we're also deciding that we're going to be the ones to preserve them and to care for them and to curate how they become public. And so that's where we're at right now. And what started off as a one-man show has grown into a really wonderful team of dedicated scholars and volunteers and curators and etc. And so Adem here is a part of our curatorial team. She's a curatorial specialist and she's on our marketing team as well. And Frederica is also a part of our curating team and will eventually probably run the show because she's amazing. And so I think it's important that we give you that background, both because, you know, this is not something that we've seen before. And even as we continue to connect with organizations and artists and organizers all over the country, what we're finding is that no one has done this on the same scale that we have. We are actually in the process of creating workshops to teach others in Oakland and Portland and Madison, Wisconsin, and New York, and et cetera, how to preserve the murals on the same scale that we have. And now we're putting on a large scale exhibit as well. And so that's going to be a first. You know, people don't usually work with plywood and people certainly don't preserve it. And street art in itself is usually not something that people would consider for a museum, or I guess they wouldn't consider it historic artifacts either. But here we are changing the narrative and changing the structure of what we consider art to be, what we consider history and historic artifacts to be. and how and who preserved them. So I think with that, we'll kind of open up a discussion between the three of us about our work and what it means for us to be doing this work as Black women, and how it's impacted our lives and the lives of those around us in our community. If you guys have questions at all, feel free to put them in the chat. I don't know if that's a possibility, Keel, but if so, we're happy to answer any questions during this discussion period. But yeah.
We can feed any questions that we see on Facebook, which we're watching, and if anyone from the event room also has questions, we'll pass them up to you.
Perfect. Frederica, Dem, you want to give your backstories? We did not all know each other prior to this, and so part of the community that is formed in the wake of this work and in the wake of the protests is us and our wonderful team of, 30 plus volunteers. So you want to give your stories and your background?
Sure, I can start. So my name is Adim, like Lisa said. So I started with Memorialize the Movement this past February. I had just started my program in art history and museum studies at the University of St. Thomas, and part of that was doing an internship. And my professor had talked to me about the potential of it, and it honestly sounded like everything that was up my alley, so it made a lot of sense. I think for me, being born and raised in Minnesota, it's incredibly apparent the racial disparities that are here, along with the deep racism that exists everywhere, yes, but can be kind of insidious, at least within the state of Minnesota. And so for me, this is the first time that I'm able to work on a project like this that I wholeheartedly believe and support, mission and all. And the fact that I'm able to work alongside a majority Black woman team and with people that look and, experience the world in the same way I do is something that I don't encounter, as my work and my education and really most of my life is in predominantly white spaces. So this has not only been a really great learning experience for me in the context of the internship, but also like a deep spiritual experience too, being that I'm able to find healing and growth through the action and work that I'm able to do with these amazing women. So yeah, that's a bit of my background.
Hi, my name is Frederica Simmons. I have a similar background to Adem in the way that I was also born and raised in Minnesota, actually South Minneapolis my entire life. It's making me a bit crazy, but I also am in the exact same art history program at the University of St. Thomas. How I came into it is a little bit different though. I work very closely with my mentor, Dr. Heather Shirey, on the research team for the Urban Art Mapping Project. And part of that project entails the creation and maintenance of the George Floyd street art, anti-racist street art database, which I welcome you to look up. And that is also crowdsourced, so please contribute to it as you see fit. But really for me, because I will fully acknowledge this, I am a light-skinned Black woman, and I know that carries a lot of privilege to the extent that as a child, my father, who is a dark-skinned Black man, would tell me that Minneapolis is the most racist place he has ever lived. But as a child, I couldn't grapple with what that meant. I didn't understand because I was relatively protected from that, all things considered. I was aware that I looked different from my peers. It was a time when public schools in South Minneapolis were very heavily white, and there was maybe 3 mixed kids and everyone just assumed you were siblings even if you didn't know each other. So it took a long time for me to understand that the world had not changed, that things had not gotten better, that the things that we were taught in history classes and the books that I read were not as outdated as they were represented to be. And I mentioned, of course, that I didn't realize that the world was a bad place until I would honestly have to say middle school. I don't have any waking memories of 9/11 as some of my peers do. I kind of thought life was relatively okay. But the reason that this work is so important to me is because my nephew is 8 years old, which means that from the time that he was, I'd say 4, his mother, my older sister, has had to explain to him every single time a Black man was murdered in the streets by the police that we live in a culture that does not protect us. And this baby, this sweet little baby, was understood that there was a reason to be angry. And I can't imagine what it would feel like to have your childhood shattered that early on, and especially for it to happen 3 times in the Twin Cities. I can't imagine. So I do this work for my nephew. I do it because I know that with the verdict that came last week, almost 2 weeks ago now, that in that moment, despite how jaded I may feel about what progress is possible in my lifetime, in that moment, he had a representation of justice to be excited about, to the point that he celebrated with a cup of hot chocolate. And that joy is what I carry with me and what I remember as we work on this work.
Thank you. Thank you both for sharing. This is the first time the 3 of us have been in a speaking engagement together. And I think it's really powerful for me because it's usually just me. Like I said, the project started with me, and it's grown in such a beautiful way. And for a really long time, I was angry as I did this work because I was surrounded by white volunteers. I was surrounded by white people, and they were great, really wonderful people who were super helpful. And I couldn't do this work without the time and energy and resources that they put into this. But when I found Frederica and Adem, it was just like a sigh of relief that I did not have to do this alone anymore. And the passion and dedication that they both put into every bit of work that they do on this project is just so heartwarming for me, because for the longest time it was just, you can't imagine what the loneliness that I felt in this. So I'm really excited to be talking to you guys about this alongside my 2 favorite people and my wonderful team. So Frederica, you had said something that really stood out to me about your nephew. And I think that's really powerful and also really tragic, because I felt the same before I even moved to Minnesota. I'm from Chicago originally, born and raised. And I lived in Chicago when Philando Castile was killed, and then very shortly after I moved here, and at the beginning of 2017. And so this was kind of my first impression of Minnesota, is the protests and the anger and the heartbreak from the community over Philando's murder, which was, vicious. And just like George Floyd, it was on camera. And I watched the video, but not intentionally. I watched it because I was scrolling on Facebook and it just popped up. And it's really frustrating because I never intended to watch the video, and I never watched any of the videos of Black and brown people who were murdered by police on camera. And I think that speaks to this desensitization of, the murder of Black death, of the murder of Black and brown people. What are your experience with that? And did you watch the video of George Floyd? And if so, why not?
I, like you, have never had an intention to watch any of the videos. When Philando died, I think something also that's really significant to my processing is I've not been in Minneapolis. I was here only when Daunte Wright was killed. I was not here when Philando was murdered, and I was not here when George Floyd was murdered. And that disconnect, I can't even explain to you how that severed my processing of this trauma. my mother lives very close to 38th in Chicago, where George was murdered. And I remember I was at my partner's family cabin because it was Memorial Day weekend. I was just having a good time. And I remember that she texted me saying that someone had been murdered outside of Cup Foods, which was our local corner store. And my brain like protected me in that moment. I misread the message. I thought she said Cub Foods, the grocery store. And in that moment already, I was like several steps behind in processing what had happened. And to be honest, I still feel like I'm playing catch up. I still feel like my processing will always be stunted by that severing of the space between my communal memory with the community that I have always lived in and being gone when these major events happen, to the point where we had plans again to go out of town to celebrate. Just my sidebar, but that my partner just graduated college and we were going to celebrate. And then we realized that the verdict was coming that week. And in that moment, I knew I could not leave again. I could not be here for my community if the verdict didn't go according to plan. So just, it's hard to process.
So I've been living within the Twin Cities for the past 7 years. Although prior to living in Minneapolis, I lived in St. Paul. And so when Philando was murdered, he was actually murdered like 2-3 miles away from my house. So yeah, like Frederica said, I feel like I'm still processing in the sense that we never are really able to catch up. Even when the verdict was released, Ma'Khia Bryant was murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And so I feel like prior to starting to do all of this work, was just holding a lot of this tension and grief and anger in my body without a way to, I guess, like activate or, yeah, do something with it. And so I'm really thankful for this project in the sense that I've been able to find community, but also do something with that grief that I've been building up. And to connect with other Black creatives in that way.
Yeah. I say this all the time, but that we are divinely favored and incredibly blessed to have found each other as we have, to have been able to come together and work so well together too, because I had met Adem previously last year, only very briefly, because of course it's very difficult to maintain connections during a pandemic. And of course, had never met Lisa. So for us to be able to work together in the way that we do is nothing short of serendipity.
It is. That's exactly how I would describe it. And I think for me, this work is, I was recently on a panel and someone used language that I had never named before, but it was so real for me. They said they felt guilty. And that is why they sprung into action. And I feel that because as we talk about like Philando and people who passed before George Floyd, I didn't really process those. I didn't acknowledge them in the way that I should have because I couldn't. I just graduated college and I had my life ahead of me and I couldn't allow myself to go into that dark place at that time. And so I just didn't. I chose not to. And I think that is why when I say that nothing before, finding out about George Floyd's murder mattered is because at that moment, my body made a decision for me. Like, you can no longer ignore this. We cannot allow you to continue to bury these murders and bury this trauma and not process it. Like, this is it. This is the one that's going to change you. And it did. And I think that this project is really serendipitous in a lot of ways because it shaped me into who I am today. It shaped me into an organizer and a leader and an activist. And it introduced me to people who have changed my life and impacted me in such positive ways. But also, I think it's helped me process a lot of the trauma that I was feeling it's helped me come to terms with it. And this is hard work. This isn't easy work. I mean, as Black women, we are constantly reliving the trauma of the people whose names we are trying to memorialize in this project. But it's also really physically taxing. The boards are 8 feet tall, 4 feet wide, and about 50 or 60 pounds heavy. And so it's hard. But at the same time, I think carrying that burden, physically carrying that burden, does allow you to process and heal and reflect. And it also gives you this sense of purpose in the work that you're doing, where I think we can all attest to the fact that what we were doing before this is meaningless in comparison. I mean, we were all working for white people. We were all working in white institutions. We were all just kind of complacent and not really doing anything that gave our lives meaning, or that gave meaning to, you know, our community. And so I think this project has been really beautiful in that it's allowed us to see our people and the work that we're doing for our people in such a different light. And I think that purpose has been really helpful for me moving forward and processing this constant trauma that we're facing as we do this work. So I wanted to ask you, but you kind of answered it already, Adim, how this work has impacted you. And I just answered it. Frederica, how has this work helped you or hindered you in processing some of that trauma? How has it kind of added or subtracted to your life as a whole?
A great question. I think there's phases to it. I think that there's something that is incredibly therapeutic to be working on the exhibition that's coming up from May 21st through the 23rd in Phelps Field Park, because we'll be placing these works of art again back into the community, activating them in a space that's never existed before for this type of work, and to do it in such close proximity to, again, Cup Foods, 38th in Chicago, where George was murdered, and to do it in my community, the community that my mom still lives in, even if I'm not living with her anymore. That in itself is very powerful for me. But then, unfortunately, there are always people who do not understand our work. And that in itself is I don't want to say an unfair burden, but it was a burden that was anticipated, but still is disappointing every time it's encountered. That in this instance, there really is a black and white. There is a clear yes and no, a right and wrong. And despite that clarity, that there are people who just completely miss it in its entirety. So again, there's a flow to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've encountered a lot of adversity. And it's because what we're doing is so unconventional. What we're doing has not been heard of. And I think I named it a while back. There is, and I hate to use this word, but it's true. There was a sort of purity in what I did in going out to collect the boards, because I don't work in a museum structure. I don't have a background in a museum in like the museum field or conservation or curatorial work. I'm not even an artist. And so for me, it was a trauma response. It was me going and collecting these murals as a way to cope with what was happening without having to admit to myself that I was in pain. It was a physical act of going and collecting, and then just sighing a sigh of relief once I knew that they were safe and they wouldn't be destroyed. But for a lot of people, there were talks about collecting the murals, but nobody really took that initiative because no one knew how, because it had never been done before. And so, you know, all of these curators and artists and institutions and organizations were sitting in a room together trying to figure out what the best method to go about this was. And I didn't have that experience because I didn't have that experience. And so, you know, as we've done this work, I think it's been so interesting to see how angry what we're doing has made people who are in those circles, who do work in those fields. Because there's a structure, there's a process, you know, that people want to follow, and we don't follow that because I don't know to follow that. And so I think it's really interesting, and it sucks sometimes because, you know, we're up against a system that was never meant to have us in this leadership position. We're up against a system that was never meant to allow us to tell our own stories. But at the same time, we're doing it and we're thriving, and we're largely successful in that. Either of you want to speak more to that?
Yeah, now that you've mentioned it too, I think that also something that was unexpected was that you'd be able to find people who do this work. I do work in a museum. I deal with this every day, and I know the systems, and I know what we can do, and I know what we can avoid to keep us moving forward in the direction that we want. And I think that I don't think people were counting on that to happen. I think people looked at you and said, oh, she doesn't know what she's doing. She's going to get tired of it eventually, and then she'll bring out the boards to the museum or something. Despite the fact that most museums took a clear stance and were like, no, we won't take these. No, it belongs in the community.
And they thought the community didn't know what to do with them.
So it's almost as if they themselves made a mistake years back when they hired me, and they had no idea. You've made a mistake letting Black people into your museums because all of this equity work, all of this anti-racist work will have an end goal, regardless of whether or not the white supremacist organization sees it or believes that it will ever occur. Because again, these institutions are historic. These are centuries built. This is not, the building itself is a living, breathing, ferocious creature that just consumes everything it can and consumes these cultures and chews them up and spits them out, but not us.
Yeah, I would say I'm in the same boat as you in the sense that I don't have a lot of museum experience or curatorial experience. And even as these boards were coming up a year ago, I remember a conversation with my roommate who mentioned he was hoping someone was doing something with the boards. And I said, I don't know how they'll do it, but I just hope it's not an institution. And so to be here a year later, helping with that whole initiative and learning these different skills that I never thought I could have has been really empowering in the sense that, like we've been talking about, these museum spaces were never meant for people like us. They were never meant for Black people. And so I attribute a lot of my lack of experience to the fact that those spaces are really hard to get into. And so the fact that I'm able to do this work and not have it be, I don't know, soul sucking, because it's genuinely fulfilling to me, because this work is my life. It's not theoretical. So to be able to do this alongside Black women, I can't stress enough, has been so amazing.
Yeah, you said something that I think I want to go back to. You talked about feeling empowered. And that's something that I have felt too in this, because, you know, I've been able to name recently that being in a leadership role is a completely new experience for me. I've worked multiple jobs. I'm 28 years old, been out of college for a while now, and never have I been in a leadership position. You know, never has anyone thought or wanted to kind of like develop my professional growth or my personal growth into a supervisor role or a manager role or anything like that. And so in these jobs that I've worked in the past, and I've worked for a long time in higher education, it was always kind of like, I'm this work mule, the least paid person in the office doing the most amount of work, and everyone looks to you for diversity and inclusion, but nobody really wants to kind of like hone in on your skills and kind of develop your growth or your professional experience. And so falling into this work has been a really empowering experience for me as a Black woman, because I get to be a leader. And it turns out that with the freedom to explore those skills, I'm good at it. I'm passionate about it. I found my niche. I found my thing that I love to do. And I love working with other Black people, which is another thing that I've never been able to do in previous like institutions and corporations. And so I think this work has been really amazing in that it's taught me and taught us, you know, that we can create our own table. We don't need to sit at their table, you know? We can create our own table and we have the skills to do it. And even if we don't have the skills, we can learn them fairly easily without spending $80,000 on a degree. But you also named something that I think is important to touch on too, which is that you said this is your life. And I think that is our driving force. That is why we've been so good at this and why we're so passionate and we've put so much into it, because this isn't just a hobby or a career for us. This is our life. You know, our lives are on the line. Yesterday, it was Daunte Wright, but it could be any of us tomorrow. And that is why we do this work. That is why we're fighting, because, you know, it's Frederica's nephew. It's my brother. It's Adem's relative on the line here. This isn't something that we can just decide to give up on when we're tired of it or when we're done. This is our future that we fight for every day. And that is why we are so good at it. That's why we thrive here.
Exactly. I think we have a couple of questions coming in. The first one being, how can people get involved?
One of you want to answer? Sorry.
Oh, no, it's okay. So we have a website, first off, that you all should go to and open your purses and help fund this work. I didn't mean to make you laugh while you're drinking water, but truly, honestly, put your money where your mouth is. If you are about this work, if you are about Black empowerment, police abolition, help us fund this work because we need it. So go ahead and go to www.Memorialize the Movement, and you'll be able to very easily find the donate button. If you're local to Minneapolis or are fully vaccinated and would like to come visit for the exhibition, you are more than welcome to do so as well. There's a place to register for tickets. They're entirely free, but for COVID reasons, we do need to have a count of how many people are coming in and out of the space, and the tickets help us do that. And then any other ways?
Yeah, I'll just add a little bit of context to why we need donations. And that is because we are running out of space. We purchased or we rented a storage space back in October of last year. That was 1,000 square feet. And at the time we had 327 boards. And now we are just at about 800. We have a pickup this Saturday that I believe will put us there. And with the murder of Daunte Wright, so many more boards have come up. Literally every place that we collected boards from has new boards on them now. We don't have the space to continue to collect, but Daunte's story deserves to be told in the same way that we have told George Floyd's story, and in the same way that we have memorialized his life and his death. And so we need to find a bigger space, and that is what we're raising money for, is to be able to find a larger space where we can continue to expand the organization, expand this collection, and ultimately be able to display the murals year-round in our own gallery or museum or display space. And so if you guys can give, we would really appreciate that. Was there another question, Keel?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of questions. Is it cool if I just ask it verbally?
Yeah.
Well, in Minnesota, you know, a big part of the restructuring, reimagining, repair that needs to happen also relates to Indigenous people. And so how have you seen that intersect, you know, with Black artists, cultural spaces, those sorts of things? Are there obstacles? Is that an opportunity for unity and like collective impact, or how does that look to you?
Yeah. Well, by and large, what we've seen is this coming together of the BIPOC in Minnesota. You know, at every protest and at every arts event, including our upcoming exhibit, we have Indigenous and Native American people coming to table. We have artists and we have, you know, performers and dancers who can speak to, you know, that culture and how it relates to what we're going through in this collective struggle. And I think that that's really beautiful. We've seen more than anything, this trauma has brought our communities together instead of divided us. We found opportunities to support one another. You know, with the houseless communities here in Minneapolis, they're predominantly Indigenous people. And you've seen Black organizations come out in droves to help food, to offer them tents, sleeping bags, and resources. And in kind, they've been here for us at every protest. They've helped us by volunteering their time, by coming out and performing rituals and sacred dances at our events and clearing the space for us. I think it's been really powerful to see how the different cultures here, because there are a lot of different cultures here in Minnesota, they're just kind of few and far between, have come together and kind of joined in solidarity.
Absolutely. And also to clarify for other viewers, I'm sure the person asking this question knows this, but Indigenous sovereignty and liberation and Black liberation are two movements that are inseparable. Mm-hmm. We are intertwined inherently. These are our kinfolk, even with all of the things that may separate us. Mm-hmm. And as a colonial settler police state is oppressing us and those who have lived before us. And an uncommonly known fact is that Indigenous people are actually the ones that are the most frequently murdered by the police. And that's not known for a reason. So we are inseparable movements in that way.
That's for the next session, Lisa, but maybe just to close us out, talk about, you could talk about what's coming up with the exhibition in May.
Yeah, so in May, from the 21st through the 23rd, we'll be doing a large-scale exhibition of some of the murals that we have created. We're going to have 200 of the boards out on display in Phelps Field Park, which is just a few steps from where George Floyd was killed last summer. And we really thought that this would be an opportunity for our community to heal, reflect, process, and grow together. And so we're kind of simulating the experience of taking you back to the summer of 2020, when the boards were on businesses and storefronts around the Twin Cities. When you come into the exhibit, you'll be kind of walking through streets, if you will, seeing the boards as they would have been up on businesses and storefronts last summer. We think that it's going to be heavy, it's going to be hard, and it's going to trigger a lot of people, but hopefully in that same frame, it offers people a chance to heal and to process in a way that we are still learning to do, and to open up conversation and speak to one another about their feelings and about their trauma and their pain, and about the changes they want to see in this country and in this city, and how we can go about, starting to make those changes. And then to accompany that really hard kind of exhibit that we're going to put on, we're going to have 18 Black and Brown artists creating new murals on blank boards that we provide for them, and we'll be paying them to do so. And then over the 3 days, we'll also have 12 performers, dancers, spoken word artists, and community speakers and leaders performing and talking to the audience throughout the 3 days. And then to kind of offset, like I said, this really heavy exhibit, we wanted to offer people a chance to, come away with a positive experience. And so we're going to have mental health resources there at the exhibit for the 3 days. We're going to have free legal resources. We'll have LGBTQIA resources. We will have food insecurity resources, housing insecurity resources for people, as well as Black arts organizations that people can connect with. And then a couple other respite spaces and healing spaces around the exhibit where people can kind of use their hands and create something beautiful out of this really kind of traumatic experience. And so we're hoping that if you're able to, you can come out and experience this with us and heal with us as a community. And yeah, either of you want to add to that?
And bring your children. Mm-hmm. Make sure that if you have little ones in your life, that they're here too. Like I said, they're watching. They're always watching, always absorbing. And to be frank, unless you are a parent of your child, and even then, no, there's some bad parents out there. They're always so much more aware than people give them credit for, and they need help processing. So please bring them as well.
And then anything you want to add to close us out?
I don't think so. I think y'all did a pretty good job.
All right. Well, thank you so much for spending this hour with us. We hope that it was helpful. We hope that you got something out of it in the same way that we did. And we have our candle. Do we blow it out, Keel, or do we keep it up?
I think keep it burning.
Okay, we'll keep it burning. And yeah, we thank you.
Oh, we thank you. Yeah, this is such a compelling vision, disruptive vision in all the right ways for the whole field of collective memory. And it means a lot to us and this whole thing we're organizing to have you all here. Thank you so much for taking the time, offering your experience, your vision, your perspective. Really appreciate you.